My full name is Frank William Malloway. I have a traditional name, Siyemches. It was my grandfather's name, and it was my great-great-grandfather's name. I grew up here in Sardis. You asked me how long your family been around here. I said, well, 5,000 years plus, maybe. The history of our tribe goes back that long, and Ts'elxweyeqw, that's where we started. And recently, a few years ago, there was spelunkers, cave explorers. They found some skeletons in a cave around Ford Mountain. About 4 months ago, that the people from museum in Vancouver, Museum of Anthropology, they came back with a report that that skull was 5,000 plus years. And it was discovered in Ts'elxweyeqw River Valley. And that's where our elders tell us that's where we came from, so part of us. I went to Sardis Elementary, and it was a 2-mile walk, and there was no bus in those days. I had to walk 2 miles. I recognized this fellow, and I haven't seen him for about 50 years. He was putting on his jacket, and he says, "Hi, Frank." And it was Barry Mitchell. He lived up Promontory Hill. And we were in grade 4 and 5 together. And we used to go swimming in Ts'elxweyeqw Creek together. And my mother put our lunch together, and I had dry salmon, wind-dried salmon. And I was kind of ashamed to show it to him. And he seen me eating it, and he said, "What is that?" And I said, "Dry salmon." And he grabbed it, and he started eating it. "Oh, gee, that's good," and he finished the whole thing. I should have ran away. At one time, we used to go to Sardis, you knew everybody. You knew the storekeepers by name, and they knew you by name, and the customers, you knew them by name. But today, you don't know anybody when you go to town. You go to the mall. I entered the hospital when I was 12 years old. Tuberculosis, I was there since I was 12 years old till I was 15 when I was discharged. My grandfather, Julius, he carried the name Siyemches. He was a very hard worker and a hard drinker. And I remember him both ways, working really hard. I was just 8 years old, 9 years old. He contacted tuberculosis, and he wouldn't stay in Kokolisa Hospital. My grandmother went to visit him, and my dad took her there, and he said, "I was talking to the doctor," and my dad walked by. One jumped in my car, and I had to take him home. And the doctor said, "He can stay home as long as nobody goes to visit him because his disease is contagious." But my grandmother lived to be 110, and she looked after him till he died. My grandmother was Mary. She was from Yakweakwioose tribe, which is a little mountain in Ts'elxweyeqw. Around the freeway was probably the boundary for the different tribes, Ts'elxweyeqw and Yakweakwioose. She was born and raised right there at little west end, a little mountain. There used to be a village there. And my grandfather died when he was 78. Died tuberculosis. And that's where I contacted tuberculosis, because I loved my grandfather. I used to visit him every day. My father was Richard Malloway. He was from Yakweakwioose. My father's traditional name was Ts'elxweyeqw, and it's part of the history of the Ts'elxweyeqw tribe, because you go back to the forefathers that created the Ts'elxweyeqw tribe. One of them was Ts'elxweyeqw, the other was Siyemches. My mother was Edna, and she was from Lytton, born in Spence's Bridge, and a different tribe, Nakapmo. My siblings they're almost all gone now. There's only 3 of us left. It's Mervyn, he nicknamed him Skip. Nobody knows him by Mervyn. And Marlene Silver, Hazel Silver, Richard Jr., Vern, and Carol. There's only Marlene, Hazel, and I left. As a child, the only thing like My dad had a team they called Ts'elxweyeqw Indians. We used to play that, and then when they started a youth league, we played soccer. Soccer was the only sport I ever played. It was fun as kids. We used to make slingshots and go hunting through the bush in Ts'elxweyeqw, and a lot of bush there. Then we used to go swimming at Ts'elxweyeqw, and call it Caldas Lake Creek. And we used to do a lot of things like peeling barberry bark. You know, we used to sell it at a store that bought barberry bark, Buckerfields. And I had a cousin named Ivan Malloway. He's like a brother to me. And he's Kenny Malloway's dad. And we used to have competitions on who could make the best slingshot. And we had a fellow named Richard Julian, who was my wife Mary's brother. I didn't know Mary at the time. But he used to stay with his uncle on Bailey Road, you know, Stan Joe. And he'd show us how to make real nice slingshots. And we use, have to be a red inner tube from a car. It had that elasticity. The black inner tubes, they wouldn't stretch. We didn't have very much success killing anything. Tin cans, about all. There was times, you know, that we had a hard time, but you know, my dad was a farmer, dairy farmer, and he grew other things. You know, they had chickens. They used to buy 100 eggs, you know, or 100 little chicks, and they raise them. So we're never really hungry. They always have a potato patch. And we get hungry, go out and shoot a chicken, or go out and kill a cow. Every winter, he'd choose one of his cows that weren't producing, and he'd kill it, you know, and then have a potlatch, you know, invite the Musqueams and Lummies and Chehalis, and they meet every week somewhere, either in Ts'elxweyeqw or Chehalis or Musqueam or something. But in the old days, when my dad was running a longhouse, it once a year, Richie's party once a year, and it'd last 2 or 3 days. And Dominic Point from Musqueam told me one time, Musqueam people never had cars when I was young. We had gas boats because we were fishermen. And he said we'd get a call or a letter from Richie and say, inviting us up to Ts'elxweyeqw. And him and Vincent, his brother Vincent, would come and pick us up on their Model T cars or Model A cars and bring us to Ts'elxweyeqw to party. When the people say we're going to party, you people think we're all going to get drunk. But our party is celebration of life, celebration and visiting each other, having a potlatch or a ceremony, a feast, you know, that's what we're gathering for. Richie'd come over and he'd say, there's still a lot of cow left. You guys got to stay another day. So we ended up staying 3 days before we finished eating that cow. Then they'd bring us home again. That was, I wouldn't mind living, having something like that, you know. Our family have lost that teachings in the plant gathering, you know, and about the only thing we do is berries, you know. Berries up interior, you know, where you make Indian ice cream. Yeah, we call it wholesome. You know, it's soap berries. They make Indian ice cream out of that, and blueberries and all that. But around here, we don't have that area because it's kind of destroyed. So even salmon fishing in the Ts'elxweyeqw River, we're not allowed to anymore. Albert Louis, the last chief we had from the Louis family, he said the longhouse along here was right from my dad's old house to my old house. And he's 1,000 feet long, and it burnt down. And Bob Joe talks about all the villages that were along the Ts'elxweyeqw River, how they came down here. Across the road is just they call it a little slough now, but it used to be the main body of the Ts'elxweyeqw River, you know, and that's why they call it Ts'elxweyeqw River Road. And emptied itself out at Ts'elxweyeqw village. Because when I was a kid, I used to travel with my grandfather and grandmother, and they used to borrow a horse and wagon from my dad, and we'd go down to just above the Vetter Bridge, and my grandfather used to hook the coho salmon, dog salmon, and they'd bring it home and they'd butcher it and smoke it. You know, and I'm lucky if I can get some chum salmon for smoking, you know. But my wife said I can eat smoked salmon 3 times a day. She loves it so much. The day I got married, I never seen my dad so excited. You know, usually my dad was saying, "Oh, they won't make any good." You know, people get together, "Yeah, it won't work out." But Mary and I were the second ones to get married in our church because it was built in 1950. To see my dad jumping around with like a young kid, you know, with a camera, and it was one of my most memorable things I can't forget. When I was a patient at Kukulisa, I was discharged when I was 15, 1950. And I stayed out for about 4 years and doing odd work. And they were advertising for a nursing orderly. And my dad said, "You know that job?" And I said, "Yeah, they used to look after me." And he said, "You go and apply for that job." So I went to Kukulisa and put my application in. And my dad knew the administrator quite well. And he said, how is Frank coming along? Is he going to be chosen pretty quick? And influence, they put my application on top of the pile, and I was called in. And I stayed there for 10 years. But the first year I was there, I met Mary, my wife Mary. I was a nursing orderly and she was a housekeeper. And we ended up eventually working on the same ward. Eventually we became engaged and got married on August 27th, 1955. So I'm heading for my 60th anniversary. My children, the oldest one is Elaine. We have next is Karen and Kim, Anne, and the boys are Frank, Kevin, Jason, and the last one was Melinda. We had 4 girls, 3 boys, and my wife was saying another son would even them out. And we had Melinda. She said, "That's it, no more." I have a great-granddaughter that has a heart condition, and she's went through 4 surgeries, heart surgeries. She was heading for her 5th surgery, and she was so sick that day. And my daughter asked Richard, who was just here, if he could get some singers together and bring her in, escort her into this hall, and have a prayer session for her. You know, and the men that Richard asked to come didn't show up. So my daughter said, "Cover the kids, they know what to do." I get emotional every time I think of it, because I have so many grandchildren. And you know, when you see kids, you know, playing around, you don't think they're learning anything. But when we covered those kids with blankets, they had their own drums, they escorted their cousin in. They formed a circle and they prayed. I could show you that picture of my great-granddaughter. The doctor said 3 months recovery. There's a picture of her riding around in the parking lot with her bicycle 1 month after her surgery. So, you know, you look back at what the kids did. They drummed their cousin in, they prayed for her, and she had a quick recovery. I worked at Kukulisa Hospital for 10 years. I left there in 1964, mostly because of the low salary. I went logging, and that was a seasonal job. I reached Alaska. I got injured up there, came home, was on compensation. And I went to work for Catamount Timber in Rosedale and Campbell River. And I got a job at Nooksack, Washington with my brother-in-law. I worked there for 5 years, and it was getting too close to accidents. I packed my brother-in-law out. He got killed on the rigging. And then 2 months later, one of the bosses almost got crushed in his cab loading machine. I left there and I went to work at Ts'elxweyeqw for Catamount Timber, and I got crushed with a big log. And when I was able to find other work, I said, that's enough for me. I was working for my 2 brothers at carpenters, and I was a laborer. They were carpenters and I was a laborer. And I said, I can't do this. I got to go and get my carpenter's ticket so I can boss them around. And I went back to Vancouver, to community college. And I seen Stephen Point at one of our gatherings in the Longhouse. And I asked him, Stephen, do you know where I can get a job? I just finished school. And he says, oh, drop around Kukulitsa. They're really looking for people there. So next day I knocked on the door, and Bob Hall opened the door. And at the old, they call it the big house that was in the front of the property, Kukulitsa Cultural Center. And I asked him, Bob, I'm looking for a job. And he says, oh, I'll come back tomorrow. You can start tomorrow. Didn't even ask me what I wanted. It was so quick. So I ended up working for them as a maintenance man, and any odd job that came around, I was able to do it. The board had a meeting one afternoon, and they invited the staff to come and sit in the meeting, and Bill Mussel was the chairman of the board at the time. And he asked us, you know, what is the goal of the staff? What do you want to be? And I was just a maintenance man. I said, I'd like to be a manager of the cultural center. And everybody laughed, because I just got out of school. I was a maintenance man, but I had high ambition. You know, about 5 years later, I was manager. That was the best years I spent working with Kukulitsa Elders Group, the original Kukulitsa Elders Group. You learn so much from them. And I still pass on a lot of things I learned from Ed Leon stories. The reason for the first salmon ceremony. And Ed Leon said, you know, when Ts'elxweyeqw created this world, he put everything here that we need. We had all kind of fruit to eat, all kind of berries and that, you know. We had deer and elk and moose, anything bear, anything you needed was here. But you know, when you eat meat, you get that heavy feeling. You can't move for a while. And so this guy was praying, and he was talking to Ts'elxweyeqw, and he says, you know, we got all kind of food, but eat meat, it's no good for us. We get heavy, we get lazy. So the Ts'elxweyeqw talked to him and said, we'll send you something that it's light and it's more healthy for you. You go down the river, you make this net, a dip net. You make it, show them how to make it. We're going to send something up, you dip it in the water and pull that out. Then you cook it for your people. So they did that, and when they pulled salmon out, that was the first salmon they pulled out of the river. It was a food that the Creator sent. So the chiefs, medicine men, said, we got to thank the salmon people for sending their children. So they butchered the salmon and fed everybody, but they took the bones and the head and that back to the river and thanked the Creator, or thanked the salmon. He said, salmon people. Thank the salmon people for sending their children so we can live a good life, healthy food. And that's the story of the first salmon ceremony. So I used to go, invited, or asked to be a speaker at the funeral, and I'd go. I was asked to put programs together in the reserve, I'd go. I even went to Lytton because they were a supporting band, and we helped them with programs. And after a while, I quit getting calls, and I was telling Kat, I don't get called very often anymore. And he said, that's good. You know what's happened? I said, no. You've taught them how to look after their own courses, their own things. He said, maybe they don't need you anymore, but look at it as a successful job you've done. And I felt good about it. And Kat was always there to help me out. And when he left as manager, he recommended that they hire me as manager. But it didn't work out that way. I missed out. So I ended up leaving Cookleets and I went to work at Chehalis. They asked me to come over to be, I went logging for a while, but they asked me to come over and be a curriculum developer because Cookleets had a stalo-cetal curriculum development. So I went over there and I set up a lot of things for them, like a dark room, and we were going to all the elders and picking up old pictures and copying them and publishing with stories that they told. I had a great time for 2 years, and then they needed a manager again at Cookleets Cultural Center, so Mark Point and I applied for the manager's position. And Mark got it, and I didn't. But Chief Sam Douglas was on the board of directors, and he said, we need Frank back here. Offer him anything. Get him back here. So they offered me a job, and I took it. And I was only working with Mark for about 6 months, and the Stalo Tribal Council started. It was the first tribal council. And they asked Mark to manage it. So he went over there, and I was acting manager for about a year. And I told the board, I've been acting manager for a year. You going to keep holding me there as an acting manager? And they said, no, Mark's not coming back, so we'll make you manager. So I didn't have to apply for it, they just put me in there. So I stayed there, I was a good 13 years I was at Cookleets Cultural Center. And when I left, I went to other jobs, and a cat again phoned me, and he was working for Stalo Nation at that time. Phoned me and he said, we got a job here, I was wondering if you'd take it. And I said, what's that? And he said, working in a forestry prisons, in Ts'elxweyeqw River. They need a native liaison working with the inmates. So I took that job. And through that job, I learned how to do sweat lodge ceremonies. And then years later, it helped me out by getting a job in the federal prison. And one of the ladies knew me, but she didn't know what my background was. And first question was, can you do a sweat lodge ceremony? I said, yes. She said, you're hired. It means a lot. I think I don't deserve it, because I haven't did anything really spectacular for my people. But I've helped them in a cultural way. I've received this longhouse from our ancestors. I got so many children, I call them, that went through this home. I got people we initiated here. I don't really look after them, but I look after the home, and they call me Dad. Because when they come in here to be initiated, they start a new life. And that's why when you see dancers walking around with the cane and the new hat on, or they're starting a new life, we call them babies. They're starting a new life. And they call Mary and I Mom and Dad, or they call all their workers Dad, And I think they always, in their way, they always pray for us too, when they're on the floor. They appreciate what's done for them. And I have a man 75 years old, when I see him, he calls, hi, Dad. I was able to, working through Cookleets, I was able to pass on cultural knowledge to all the reservations. When I was working at Coquilitsa, there was a fellow named Reuben Ware. He used to work with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Mark Point was acting manager, or a manager in training. And we used to have a newsletter called Coquilitsa News. And Mark called us down to his office once and he said, "We want a newsletter that covers a valley." So Reuben and I went back to the office and Reuben kept talking about it. What do we name it? What can we name it? I said, "Well, how about Stalo Nation News?" "Right on," he said. So he started publishing a newsletter, Stalo Nation News. And people started asking, "Who's the Stalo Nation?" They didn't know who they were. You know, I remember when I was a kid, you know, and I was before I was 12 years old, my mother had to fill out forms for my dad. And she said, "Tribe. What tribe are you from?" He says, "Stalo." That's the first time I ever heard Stalo. Even when I was young and the people used to go to dances, like they'd have a dance in Chehalis or Seabird Island or Chilliwack, and different members of different bands would get together and they'd fight. "You're Chehalis," and they'd start a fight. Or "You're Kilgard," and they'd start a fight, you know. But after we start spreading the word that they're all Stalo people, they start getting along better. But I think through Captain I and Mark and Stephen Point and all those ones that really knew their culture and history were the ones that told the people who they were. But I think working with my people in a different way, not politically, but culturally, it's a difference. Because politically, I don't know nothing. But culturally, they come and ask me. That's what our kids really need, the cultural things like the canoe. You know, across the line, my great-granddaughter that had that heart surgery, she's a Slough player, a bone game. And she was only 4 years old when she entered, and she'd like mental telepathy. She wouldn't watch the other side, she'd just shake the bones and hold them. And her dad would tell her which side they guessed on, and she'd open her hand, you know. I think the first game she entered, she won $50. And she's still, my other great-granddaughter has joined her. They have a little team that they play. Positive changes, I think the closure of the residential schools. You know, people think it happened a long time ago. But it was 1976, I think, was the last residential school that was closed. And more kids seeking an education, a grade 12 education. When I was working at Coquilitsa, we had these Stalo Awards. You know, if any kids graduated, they were going to give them an award. You know, the first ceremony, I think we only had 4 or 5 graduates from grade 12, and that's the whole valley. You know, but I think since then it really increased, over 20, 30. I felt so good when I seen all those kids up there receiving their diplomas. Life in general, I think, is like the teachings of the Longhouse. You treat people the way you want to be treated. You treat people with respect, so people will treat you with respect. Not only look after people around here, you look after the people that have passed on. And that's what we do here. Twice a year we have burning ceremonies for our loved ones. And I found out it's a medicine itself. A phrase my dad used to use when he didn't want people to quit singing, like, you know, "You come back next year and sing again. Next year you sing again. Next year you sing again." He used to always say, "Keep the fires lit, keep the fires going." And my nephew's wife, she was living in Kilgard, and she looked and there was no smoke coming out of their longhouse, fire holes. So she went there and she built a fire. And then next day she'd build another fire, and somebody told my mother, "She's down there burning all the wood." And my mother talked to her and she said, "Well, Papa said to keep the fires going." She says, that's not what he meant. He just meant don't let the custom die, gathering at night. And what he meant by keeping the fires going, keeping your meetings going, you don't have to physically let the fires burn. And with this court decision that just happened the other day, I think we got a great future for us. I'm glad it happened in my lifetime. Because he used to always say, you know, I don't think they signed a treaty in my time. Because my dad said the same thing and he died before they even got to stage 1 completion, you know. And I'd like to see something happen in my lifetime. And I think the decision that the Supreme Court of Canada made the other day is a move forward for us.
It is an historic first and a landmark decision that could have huge implications right across Canada. It came from the Supreme Court of Canada, a unanimous decision today handing victory to a British Columbia Aboriginal group, ending decades of battle over its right to a piece of land. The case revolved around this 4,000 square kilometer tract west of Williams Lake, BC. The court ruled the group does have title or rights to about 1,700 square kilometers of it, to use, enjoy, and more. But what about those implications? They'll touch government, industry, and any future economic or resource development on First Nations lands, including the newly approved Northern Gateway Pipeline. We have full coverage tonight, beginning with more on the decision itself from Duncan McHugh.
What Roger Williams and the Ts'elxweyeqw chiefs told the courts their ancestors had been saying since settlers first arrived. Their lands were still theirs. Today, Canada's highest court responded.
I was ecstatic to find out that we had title, and it's about time.
For more than 20 years, the Ts'elxweyeqw argued forestry officials had no business permitting clear-cuts in Ts'elxweyeqw traditional territory without consulting them, because their rights were tied to a vast swath of BC's interior where they hunted, fished, and lived. No, responded the province, those rights only exist in tiny areas, such as their old village sites. After hearing the claim, the Supreme Court of Canada was unanimous. The Ts'elxweyeqw hold Aboriginal title to over 1,700 square kilometers, stating the title holders have the rights to the benefits associated with the land, to use it, enjoy it, and profit from its economic development. And where title is found, governments and others seeking to use the land must obtain the consent of the Aboriginal title holders. It's the first time the High Court has recognized Aboriginal title to a piece of land. Yet the justices made clear it still falls to the province to regulate land use decisions in BC, and the province can justify development if it's, quote, in the public interest. First Nations declared victory.
This has to be the wake-up call for governments, both the provincial and the federal governments.
With large parts of BC not covered by treaty, the ruling will most certainly impact resource extraction industries, such as oil and gas, mining, or logging.
And we're moving away from the world of mere consultation into a world of consent. And that is absolutely enormous when one considers Enbridge's Northern Gateway Pipeline proposal, the Kinder Morgan Pipeline proposal.
The BC government cautiously welcomed certainty around the rules.
We've seen the benefits that come to First Nations communities, and indeed to all of us, when First Nations have the opportunities to fully participate in the economy.
Before today, Aboriginal title was kind of a theory. It existed somewhere out here, but no one was sure where. Now we know First Nations essentially control pretty hefty chunks of their traditional territory, and Peter, there's no question that this is going to shake up the BC treaty process.
You're right, Duncan, but it doesn't end with BC. There's a lot at stake here for Aboriginal groups right across Canada, right?
Yeah, certainly in parts of Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, anywhere where land cession treaties don't exist. And the decision makes pretty clear there's no question that Aboriginal groups are now going to have a stronger hand at the negotiating table.
I'm ready to claim the property down up Ts'elxweyeqw Valley. In the future, I'd like to see all our people come together as one, like a Ts'elxweyeqw tribe under one management. Burnout village. Yakweakwioose. Yakweakwioose means burnt. The Wayus means, I guess, village or whatever.
Well, I think we could sit here for hours and talk.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. First chapter.
That's right, there'll be a sequel.
Yeah.